Welcome everyone to the Combined Knowledge Office 365 webinar series. My name is Eric Shups. I'm a SharePoint Server MVP or Offices and Services and Servers MVP or whatever we're calling ourselves these days. Today we'll be discussing an introduction to Azure AD Web Applications. This is a developer-focused webinar. As I'll mention as we go through here, the slides will be available later. Combined Knowledge will make the video presentation available as well, and the code that we're going to reference is in the GitHub repo that I will mention to you in the webinar as well. If you have any questions during the webinar, please post them into the chat channel. I'll be monitoring that. I'll try and answer them if they're relatively brief and short during the presentation. If not, hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end where I can address the questions that are remaining. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Here's the different ways that you can contact me. Should you want to follow up after this webinar, you can find me on Twitter and on Facebook. Go to my blog at SharePointCowboy.com or www.ericshups.com. You can view this slide presentation and others at slideshare.net/eshups. And you can also find me on github.com/eshups. If you go to ericshups.com, you'll find a link to the GitHub repo. In the upper right-hand corner, you can download the code for this presentation and follow along if you like. So here's our agenda. We'll briefly do a quick introduction, then talk about the development model for Azure AD Web Applications, move into a little bit on security and authorization and authentication. Talk about how the apps are created and configured. We'll discuss the differences between single tenant and multi-tenant. And then finally, we'll talk about some of the specific scenarios around deployment that you need to be aware of. So let's begin the discussion with identifying where Azure AD applications fit into the various development models for SharePoint and Office 365. If you've been around the SharePoint space for some time, you already realize that full trust solutions are the most mature development model that we have. They apply only to on-premise implementations of SharePoint, everything from 2003 all the way up through 2016. Not a lot has changed there over the last few years. Most of the investments have been in the cloud space, but full trust solutions are still a fully supported and feasible manner of doing customizations in SharePoint if you're running on premises. In fact, there are many things you can do in full trust solutions that you can't do in cloud solutions because you have access to the machine and have full control over the environment. In the move to the cloud, Microsoft needed a way to provide customizations off box or in a way that doesn't impact other users in the shared tenancy model that Office 365 uses. So they came up with the add-in model that was released in SharePoint 2013. This model is primarily targeted really to ISVs, consultants providing package solutions, or enterprises and organizations that have sort of ancillary solutions they'd like to include. And they're designed primarily for things that you plug into SharePoint or that work with SharePoint. They're not really designed to extend the SharePoint platform all that much or to customize the SharePoint platform. Because of the isolation model that add-ins work, they were never really targeted effectively for that. Subsequent to the add-in model came the SharePoint Framework. SharePoint Framework is designed for customization of the platform. If you watch the recent announcements made at the virtual SharePoint event, you would have heard some new things about the framework. There's new extensibility options coming. There's application extensions, and now we can do field customizers and other things besides just web parts coming in the framework. As this matures, it will become sort of the de facto model for doing branding and in-depth customizations and whatnot inside of Office 365 and hopefully also on premises as well. Now, the Azure AD application stack stands completely aside from all of the SharePointy stuff for add-ins and the framework. In fact, there really are no SharePoint requirements whatsoever for building Azure AD web applications. They're standalone. They're designed to run in Azure using Azure resources. But the most important aspect of them is the Azure AD dependency, that they're tightly tied in with your cloud authorization or authentication store. This gives them some advantages. One, that they are available globally throughout your entire Office 365 tenancy and across all the products. So from Word and Excel and whatnot, all the way through to the SharePoint pieces of Office 365 as part of the app launcher. And they're the only model that gives full single sign-on between the applications without having to go through the authorization model necessary for add-ins and for some of the other framework pieces. They do, however, work with SharePoint and Office 365 via the Microsoft Graph and also via the endpoint APIs available in the REST APIs from SharePoint, but primarily through the Graph. And in that scenario, you will use the authorization schemes that you would do for any disconnected scenario like mobile apps or whatnot. They have a slightly different deployment model, and they can be run in a single tenant or a multi-tenant mode. We'll drill down into all those pieces as we talk about them. So really, Azure, it used to be back in the day, we would talk about taking .NET applications or standalone applications in the enterprise and moving some of those components into the architecture of SharePoint, changing web pages to application pages or web parts, and Windows services into timer jobs and whatnot. But most of the code we were writing for those things didn't really have anything to do with SharePoint. We were just leveraging the SharePoint infrastructure. Azure allows us to do a more direct lift and shift of, say, legacy applications or new greenfield applications directly into the cloud with full integration into our domain for single sign-on. If you're doing hybrid Azure AD Sync, full single sign-on from on-premises with the same user ID all the way into the cloud. It's a much more straightforward path. You can use Azure ASP.NET, or I'm sorry, not Azure, ASP.NET MVC or Web API or really whatever development model that you desire for Azure web applications. Deploy them onto your Azure infrastructure so that you can manage them as part of your ALM deployment, and it gives you more of a traditional development feel with hooks back into the Office 365 infrastructure as you need them. So that's where it fits inside of the scheme of customization options or development options for Office 365. The way that it works is pretty straightforward. You have an Azure web application or website that you're running. This can be just a straight up web service, or it can be a standalone virtual machine, or however you want to provision those resources in Azure. Your authentication mechanism is Azure AD, so users will sign into your app using Azure AD, and then it will talk via the APIs to whichever Office 365 services or Graph services that you want to integrate with. Talk directly to SharePoint if you need to exchange things with SharePoint, and then it gets exposed to the user in the app launcher. It's important to note, however, that the user doesn't have to go to the app launcher in order to access the application. They could just go to a URL. They can navigate to any URL you give them. They can, if you give them a sign-in link, they can log into the application and they'll be fully signed on. So if they were, for example, to click a link from your application over to their Office 365 tenancy, it'll come right up without them having to log in because they're already authenticated into Azure AD. So it's the same user principle all the way along the chain. But the app launcher gives a nice way for global access throughout your tenancy to the apps that you've deployed. Let's talk now about what works and what doesn't in the Azure AD development model. You can use any of the CSOM if you're doing .NET. On the back end for your Azure app, you can use the client-side object model, and you can use the REST APIs just like you would with any other remote application. And you can use, obviously, the Microsoft Graph, which is also a REST API. For connectivity back to the Office 365 suite of services, including Delve and all the other endpoints that you can access, mail, calendars, etc. You can use any of the Azure stack that you wish and configure this in any way that works for you. So if you have a very large, very robust application and you want to use things like the traffic manager and the virtual networking and the global CDN and all of the various different IaaS components of Azure, have at it. However you want to configure the application is up to you. You are really just creating a standalone web application that does not depend on the Office 365 infrastructure the way that, say, SharePoint hosted apps do, or even to a lesser degree, provider hosted apps for SharePoint. This means whatever your source control methodology is, whatever you do for automated builds and deployment, it doesn't even have to be on the Windows platform, can be on the Unix platform. All of these can be integrated into your process in whatever way works best for your organization. The big advantage that Azure AD apps have over all the other SharePoint development models is the single sign-on piece. With add-ins, you had to do OAuth authorization for any type of connectivity back into SharePoint. So you had to handle tokens and do all the token management and stuff back and forth to communicate with SharePoint. And to a certain degree, you still have to do that with Azure AD if you're calling back into the graph. But there was no way to have a consistent user principal from SharePoint over to the add-in. There just was not an authentication shim in between those. So if you wanted to do forms-based authentication on both, then it means you had to integrate your own forms authentication. Or if you wanted to do NTLM and have a single sign-on, say a provider-hosted app running inside your infrastructure with Office 365 up in the cloud, you had to have all the Azure AD Sync stuff working, and potentially ADFS and whatnot. Framework, it lives inside of SharePoint, so there's no authentication you can embed there at all. It's assumed to be in context, much like the JSON model, although you can still communicate with the graph, or will be able to communicate with the graph in some of the new upcoming things that they announced back at the Virtual Summit. You can deploy directly from Visual Studio into Azure. If you're using Visual Studio on .NET, you can deploy directly that way and have full access to the Azure suite of services. Things that don't work include JSON. JavaScript object model only runs on Box and SharePoint hosted apps, so it doesn't apply here. You can, of course, write your own if you want to do Angular apps or Knockout or Handlebars, or whichever JavaScript flavor of the month that you're using. You can do that. You just don't have the SharePoint JavaScript object model to utilize. As such, there's no inherited context for that. In fact, there's no request to say context info as you would do with a provider hosted app either, because there's no app principal inside of SharePoint for it to reference. So you have to go through the ADAL or graph authorization scenario in order to make those connections. You're not deploying things into SharePoint, so there's no declarative artifacts like you could do with provider-hosted apps when you build an actual SharePoint app. That doesn't mean you can't do some of those things. You can, connecting to the sites and files endpoints. You can do that, or directly to the REST endpoints, but you just can't do them as part of an app deployment. Thankfully, there's no need for app webs and host webs and all that, as these are running completely out of the environment. One thing to be aware of that we're going to talk more here in a little bit is if you're doing multi-tenant Azure AD web applications, the Visual Studio templates are incomplete for building an end-to-end scenario. They work great for doing single tenant models, which we'll talk about here in a minute, not so much for multi-tenant. I'm going to show you what we need to do to get it working for a multi-tenant scenario, and also show you where in the code I have samples for building out the databases and the various pieces and parts that you need to get all that working. Azure AD apps, as I've mentioned, have two scopes: single tenant and multi-tenant. A single tenant Azure AD app is bound to a single AD domain. These are internal apps, things you would develop for your organization, or if you're a consultant, things that you would develop as piecework for a client, or any type of bespoke applications that you're building for a specific scenario. These are bound to a single Azure AD instance, and they can't be accessed by other domains. This includes scenarios where you have multiple Azure AD domains for an environment. Now, I'm not talking about where you have multiple DNS top-level domains that you're binding into Azure. I'm talking about actual instances of Azure Active Directory that you can only have in single tenant mode. That app is bound to that Active Directory domain that it was developed under and can't be accessed by anything else. That makes the authorization model actually very simple because it is in a singular domain. Everything is controlled with the application inside of that domain. You don't have to worry about exposing it elsewhere and naming conventions and whatnot. And those are pretty easy to do. Fire up Visual Studio and select the single tenant, as we'll see in our walkthrough here in a few minutes, and just start developing and deploying. Although there's still some deployment vagaries that you need to be aware of. Now, the multi-tenant scenario is more complex. In a multi-tenant scenario, you have an Azure AD domain as the developer or creator of the app that you build the app against. So you open Visual Studio, you get all the stuff set up. You have to have all of the Azure AD pieces in place yourself as the developer. So you have to have an Azure AD tenancy. You have to have some resource groups configured and whatnot in order to make this stuff work. Thankfully, those are Azure AD, at least the basic version is free. And so as an individual developer, you could get away very cheaply with doing this. You don't have to spin up a lot of infrastructure for it in the development phase. Once it's been developed and debugged and tested, you then expose it to other domains where they can connect. You can put it into the gallery. You can give them direct links to the application. But the application then gets deployed to their domain, and they manage some of the settings inside of their own domain. So you have one master domain, and if you wish, you would have connected or peer domains that would use the application as well. But it'll always be at the root in your domain. You do need to be a little bit aware of naming conventions when you do that. On the consent screen, it actually shows the parent domain that it came from. So if your domain is test developer 123 ABC, users are actually going to see that. Customers are actually going to see that on the consent screen. So you need to pay attention to how you name those domains to make them to make it look professional, and so users don't get confused. And also, when it's in their app, enterprise app directory, they'll see it listed there as well. As naming conventions are important. There's a two-step process to actually making this work for users. The first thing that has to happen is an Azure admin in a multi-tenant scenario. An Azure admin has to authorize the app for their domains. There's a specific consent flow process that they have to go through. I'll show you in the next slide, I think it is, where I have the link that you have to use, the URL format that you have to use for the authorization. It has to be, the authorization grant has to happen by an Azure admin. This can get a little bit confusing for some folks because they assume that the Office 365 tenant administrator is also the Azure administrator. And oftentimes that is not the case. If you had an existing Azure AD environment, or you set it up separately from Office 365 and added Office 365 later, or changed up how that works, then your Azure admin could be different from your Office 365 admin. So Azure AD apps have to be authorized by the Azure admin, which may, in some cases, be the Office 365 tenant admin, but I find that often that is not the case, and it causes some confusion. And that is the one and only user, or other users that you have delegated admin authority to are the only ones that can authorize the app. The easiest way that seems to make the most sense for people is to get your Azure AD application published to the Azure Gallery, and then the Azure admin is already in Azure going to add the apps, you already had the right person logged in to do the authorization. So it seems to flow a bit easier that way. I'll show you how we work around that in the Combined Knowledge Training Plus product, and how we have a screen that identifies what needs to be done and by whom to help users along. And then the app owner has to manage the tenant registration. So you, as the developer, the owner of the app, has to keep a database of all the tenant IDs and issuing authority keys that come back through the sign-in process. So whether you're doing local storage, or we use an Azure SQL database, there has to be some mechanism for you to manage those keys. And I'll show you in the sample app how we do that. Just a quick review on the security model for Azure AD apps. It is SSO, all forms-based, SAML with all the new sign-in flow. So there's no NTLM or anonymous. That doesn't mean you can't have anonymous pages as part of your application. You certainly can. You could have, say, a landing page, a marketing landing page for people. We do that with Training Plus, and then give them a sign-in link where they can click on the sign-in. And then go through the consent process that way. But it does assume the Azure AD login and SSO flow. Because it's Azure AD, it's all low trust. There's no high trust configuration like you would have to do for on-premises SharePoint provider-hosted apps. And then the one thing that you need to pay attention to is groups in Azure AD. Hopefully we'll have some time. I'm going to move quickly enough that I hope we can get to this, but there is a deployment mechanism. They changed the way apps are deployed and provisioned to users when they moved it from the classic portal to the new portal. It used to be when a Azure AD admin authorized the app for the domain, everybody in the domain automatically received it in their app launcher. That's not the case anymore. It seems like they're pushing towards having Azure AD Premium to use enterprise apps so that you can assign them to groups. And when you go through the process in the Azure portal, it kind of seems like that is the primary flow. There is, however, another way to do that that doesn't require Azure AD Premium in order to do group assignments to users, and I'll show you that workaround as well, but it's something you need to be aware of. This is also an advantage of Azure AD in apps, in that they're the only one that can be provisioned by group. You can't do that with add-ins, and you can't do that with the framework, whereas with Azure AD Web Apps, you can, and those are groups inside of your Active Directory. Authentication is done via the Azure AD sign-in page. Unfortunately, that's not something that we as developers can control. We cannot modify the login experience. If you're using ADFS, you know or should know by now that you have a custom image and screen that you can put up for the login panel that has your company logo or whatnot. But the actual login mechanism over on the right-hand side with the username, password, and all that jazz is controlled by Microsoft. It lives at login.windows.net, and there's nothing that we can do to change that. This is unfortunate because the user interface is really suboptimal. It's that narrow panel for doing the login. It does its weirdness around corporate accounts and plopping. If you have multiple accounts you use, it plugs in accounts you don't want into there, and you're constantly having to go back and forth. But the real challenge is down at the bottom. The error information is in this tiny gray text down at the bottom, and you don't have any way to provide messages to users. You can't guide them through the process. So when they get to the consent screen, you can't provide them any information on what they should click and how they should be doing it. That's unfortunate. The workaround for that is to provide a sign-in page that gives them some information on how to do that. I'll show you how we did it. Your mileage may vary as to how you want to do that, but just be aware that is a non-customizable experience. Once they're logged in, they single sign-on with all the other Azure resources. In your app, you identify which resources you want to have access to. So if you want to be able to read from the graph or post messages, read all a users' emails and put items in their calendar and all that sort of stuff, you will ask for that in the consent grant. It will identify those in the consent, and the user has to accept that. It lives in the context of the app launcher, and what it's supposed to do is when a new app is available, it should show up in the little bell icon in the suite bar and tell users that a new app is available. In my experience, that does not work consistently. Sometimes it never shows up at all. Sometimes it shows up an hour, 2 hours, 24 hours, so I wouldn't rely upon that mechanism. The challenge, of course, there is that the app launcher is starting to get rather cluttered, and users have to actually go in and find the app and pin it themselves. So you need to make folks aware that a new app is available. As I said, your mileage may vary there. I've seen it all over the map as to whether it actually does the notifications or not. Hopefully it works in your tenant and your customer tenants. When you are setting up the authorization framework for the apps, there's a few things that you need to know. First, if you are doing any type of single page application with JavaScript, specifically Angular, or if you're doing React or some of these other full page models, you're going to be developing single page applications. As such, you want to have the OAuth 2 implicit flow set to true in your app manifest. I'll show you where that is and how you can modify that. So you can turn that on. You don't technically need it on a page-to-page type of application, but it's very helpful for the spas because of the way that they post back and whatnot. There's some token and authorization endpoints that you'll need to become familiar with as you're if you want to interact with, say, graph resources. You'll want to change the tenant ID to common if you're doing multi-tenant instead of, by default, the Visual Studio templates will put the tenant ID that you've created into the endpoints, and you want to change that to common, and also for the WS-Fed endpoint, change that to common. If you follow along with the way I have it set up in the sample application that I have out on GitHub, all this stuff is already in the right place for you, so it should be pretty easy to map yours over to that. Remember that in the consent, the first time they do the consent, that the authorization by the tenant admin does not automatically equal user assignment. There's a specific way you have to do this too. In order to get the consent page to show, you have to use a URL in this format. You need to go to the OAuth 2 endpoint, and specifically, in addition to these other things that are required, like the client ID of the app, that's the one you've registered, response type, your redirect URI, etc. You need to have this prompt equal admin consent. That will send it to the admin consent page and allow them to consent. If they're adding it through the gallery, it will automatically do the consent for them. This is if they're going through your application. The app's going to be looking for different types of permissions. So you could do app permissions and delegated permissions. These are in the Azure configuration panel, and you'll see where they are to assign those. The minimum one that you need is sign in and read user profile. That is not actually the one that is on the Visual Studio template. That one is slightly different. And I'll show you in the walkthrough here in just a second. Various resources that you can access. Here's a list. They're growing by the day of the things that you can get access to and your application can ask for resources for. Beware the permission level restrictions that you're asking for. If it's asking for something that the user can't authorize themselves that needs an admin authorization, then they won't be able to individually authorize that. Okay, so let's jump into Visual Studio and let's create a multi-tenant app from scratch. And we'll walk through the process. I'll show you some of the things you need to be aware of. And then we're going to switch to one that's already been built, which is the demo sample that I have out on GitHub. And I'll walk you through the various scenarios that we need to facilitate in order to get multi-tenant fully functional. In other words, we'll pick up where the gaps in the Visual Studio templates leave off. So I'll do a file new project. And we'll choose our cloud project here, and we'll do an ASP.NET web application just for simplicity. And I'll give it a random number here. This will launch the configuration screen. Now you could choose any of these you want with the exception of empty. Whether you want to do Web API or SPA or any of these here is somewhat irrelevant. The thing that is relevant is this button right here, change authentication. If you don't do this, you're going to produce a single tenant app. In change authentication, I come down here to worker school accounts, and here's where I can change from cloud single to cloud multiple. Now I can put in a specific domain here if I want. If you have a custom domain, you can put that in here. And I do have a custom domain registered with Azure, so I can put that in here and it'll read from my Azure tenancy there. Now, here's the tick box that says directory access permissions, read directory data. Don't check this because that's a admin level permission. It's not actually the permission that you want. The default permission in the user profile will automatically get added for you as a base for the app. So you do not need to check this here. If you have a client ID that you've already assigned or one that which is just a GUID, you can put that in here if you want to overwrite the client ID. Otherwise, it will generate one for the app. So I'll click OK. Now it's going to ask me to log in. This is logging into my Azure tenancy. So I need to be have an account that has Azure AD domain admin rights when I'm logging in here, because I'm going to be creating objects in Azure AD. So let's log in there, and that'll take me to the next screen. It needs to pull back some information about my tenant, including my resource groups and plans, service plans, so that it can wire everything up for the solution. So we'll give that just a second. There we are. Okay. So now it's good to go. I'll click OK. Now I'm using Visual Studio 2017. In this example, 2015 and 2013 have a slightly different flow at this point. This is going to bring up a screen, or should bring up a screen, asking me what component resources I want to connect to, whereas it doesn't do that in the other templates, but the end result is still the same. It's going to generate the project scaffolding and a manifest for the app. Here we go. So it comes up here and says, okay, what do you want to do here? Do you want to add it, deploy it? You have your connected services. You can say, oh, I want to integrate with the Office 365 APIs or whatnot. And then publishing out to Azure, so we can do a local publication, we can do Azure virtual machines, etc. Let's create a new profile. And in this profile, you can use one that you already have, of course. Let me switch over here. If you already have a profile that you're using, great, you can leverage that, or you can create a new one. The important bits here are to set up the resource group in the app service plan. You can start with the very basic ones, and there's different ones that you can select. You can click new here, and it'll ask for a resource group name, etc. Pick the basics to begin with. You can scale these up later in the Azure portal. It's very easy to do. So this is the minimal cost model here, is to just use the very basic service plans. I have a custom one set, or you can use a default there. And if you want to add any additional services, you can do that here, but you just need to wire these bits together so that it can be published. If you want to expose a database, you can do that. You can provision a database here as well, or you can just do that manually later. So I'm going to click on create, and now it'll push my web application 31 out to Azure, where I can see it in the portal. Now you can manage most of the settings in the new Azure portal for your apps that have been deployed. You can still manage some of the settings. In fact, some of them are a little bit easier to get to in the classic portal. So you use either or as you see fit. Here we go. Now it's publishing this out to the profile, and there it's done. Let's pop open the Solution Explorer and see what it's built. So just a standard, I think we chose Web API on there, so a standard configuration. If we go jump into our web config, we'll see that it's wired in some various pieces for us. Whoops. It's going to try and go out and show it. Azure, we don't care about that. It's wired in some pieces here like the client ID and the AAD instance. These are not sufficient for doing a multi-tenant application. There's not nearly enough information in here to get that working. So it's very basic. It also does not include a number of the piece parts and things that we need for a multi-tenant scenario. It works at a very basic level. Let's see if it popped up the... There we go. Here is the consent screen that it's asking for. Here's the sign you in and read your profile permission request. That's the one by default. We did not tick the box to read AD in the template, which you want to avoid. So that automatically gets included. When I accept this here, it'll give me, it's not running in the local host. There, that's fine. So it's gone through the consent process, and now I have the app that's deployed into Azure. And if I go into the, let's look first at the classic interface because it's a little easier to read. If we go to manage, Windows Azure, go down to the Active Directory bit down here. And if I go over to applications, I'll now see there's web application 31. So here it's been deployed into my Azure tenancy. Now let's talk a little bit about the configuration pieces. The first is the sign-on URL. This is where users are going to go to the sign-on link. So this could be, www. Whatever you want your application DNS to be.com /signin.aspx or signin.jsp or whatever you have for your sign-in page can be put in here in the sign-on URL. You can add a logo. This is the logo that will show up in the app launcher and also in the Azure Gallery. So you can add a logo here and upload it. Multi-tenant, this should be set to yes if you followed the examples. If you did single tenant and you try and convert it later to multi-tenant, it's pretty painful to do. It's actually better to just start over with the multi-tenant template than try and convert one that's single tenant to multi-tenant, because even though it looks like this is a simple switch here, it's really not that simple. Here's the client ID that was generated for the app. This should be familiar to you. This is the same as the client IDs for SharePoint apps as well. And then whether or not user assignment is required to access the app. You can, if you wish, designate that individual user assignments have to be made, meaning named users have to be assigned to the app, which is great. If that works for your app scenario, you can do that here. Then every tenancy that consumes your app will have to assign on a user-by-user basis. If you choose no, then they can assign it to groups, meaning it can be assigned to an entire domain, or you could assign it to, say, finance and HR, or however the customer wants to make those assignments. But if you turn this on, you can't use the groups feature. It has to be individual user assignment. Unfortunately, the first time it does this, it automatically creates the key secret value. And this is obfuscated. You only get to see this key when you save the page. So this initial key is not going to work. You need to create your own here. This is just a certificate thumbprint. You could do it for 1 year or 2 years. There is, by the way, no notification when that expires. You need to make a note of when it's going to expire and make sure you come in and update it or your app will stop working. When you make this selection, you then have to save it, and when you save it, it will display the key and you need to copy it, because once you navigate away from that screen, you'll never be able to get that key Again, you'll have to create a new one. And there's some places you need to input that key. So it's important. Set the key, save the page, copy the key, and put it somewhere safe. This is your app ID URI. This is just a unique identifier. It doesn't really mean anything. It's not a navigable URL, but it will show up from place to place in throughout the process and in the customer's Azure AD. So you might want to give some thought to the that app ID URI. For example, ours is combined knowledge / CK training plus. So that makes it identifiable by users. They know what they're looking at. The reply URL is where the Microsoft login screen will redirect back to when users sign in. Remember, you don't control the sign-in process anymore. That's being done through Azure. So they're going to navigate to a sign-in screen, and it needs to know where to post back. This is where you'll give it your post back. For example, HTTP, www. whatever / default.aspx. And that's where it will post back to. That post back is important because it contains the tenant ID information and the user information that on the initial one you need to store in your database. The permissions that you select can be modified here. Bear in mind, this is the owning domain for the app. If you change the permissions here, it's going to change the permission request for all of your customers who are using this app. Customers can do this individually, like if they want the app to ask for, have access to other things, you can do it on a one-off basis at the customer level. When you do it here at the master level, it will be for all customers. And you have the set of options here. You can add an application. So this is Skype, Delve, what have you, are all in there. And then you have the app permissions and the delegated permissions, right? So app permissions plus user permissions here. So that's your permission request. One of the important pieces here is the app manifest, because if you want to change things like the allow OAuth implicit flow, it has to be done in the app manifest. This is actually easier to manage in the new portal. So let's go to Active Directory. Let's find this app in the new portal because you can edit it inline in the new portal. In the old portal, you couldn't. So let's go to my app registrations here, see if we can find web application. As you can tell, I've done a lot of these. There it is. There's web application 31. And here you can click on the manifest and you can edit it inline in the portal. In the classic portal, you have to download it, edit it, and upload it again. This is what the app manifest looks like. So it identifies the app ID, what your display name is, the redirect URI, etc. Here is the OAuth to allow implicit flow option there, and some other bits and pieces for the app manifest. Most of these you don't have to mess with directly, but things like the allow OAuth, you have to do that directly here, and then you could save it right back into the app registration. Now, that's all well and good. This won't actually work for a multi-tenant scenario yet because there's a lot of pieces missing from making this happen. So let's jump into, this is the fully baked sample that I have out in the GitHub repo. If you're looking for it, it's github.com /eshups, and it's called spdemo Azure AD.rest. And so you can go grab this code. Now, I have a slide summarizing this. So let me jump to that real quick. And then we'll go look at these individual components. First of all, you need to have a database. That database needs to store tenant IDs, issuing authority keys, and sign-up tokens. It's a really simple database. In the sample code, I actually have a database script. If you're doing this in Azure SQL Database, I have a very simple script here that sets up the 4 tables that you need: the migration history, issuing authority keys, tenants, and sign-up tokens. If you wish, you can add additional things to this with the post that comes back as a big XML document. that you parse out to get the data. There's a specific section that has like the user email address and whatnot. There's not a lot of data in there to store. You don't, for example, get things like SP host URL or SP app web URL because the user isn't coming from a SharePoint context. So if you want to communicate back with SharePoint, you're going to have the user tell you what URL you want them to access for a host web. So that's, you can't automatically define that. But there is some additional information you can store if you want to. This is the basics that you'll need. Now, you'll need to parse the XML response. This is on the reply URL page, or I do it in an HTTP module. You can do it however you want to. At a minimum, in the reply URL page, you'll need to take the XML response that's posted to you by the login.windows.net page and grab the tenant and user information out of there. There's also some tokens that you can persist if you like, but to work with the graph, you need to go get a new set of access tokens anyway. You'll need to set up the federation realm and identity configuration. If you're doing HTTP redirection, make sure that's all set up, and if you want to have a sign-in page. So let's talk about those individual components. First and foremost, you need to have some objects. So we have a tenant DB context here. This has our tenants, our issuing authority keys, and our sign-up tokens. This is what actually talks to our database. And then I have a registration module that just has the tenant ID, the sign-up ID and expiration date, and the issuing authority key. So these are the base pieces here that we set up the models there to communicate with our database. Now, the registration module itself, I did this as an HTTP module in the sample code because I'm redirecting my reply URL to the base page. If you want to have a default.aspx page, for example, you can put all of this in the code behind on a default.aspx page. Here's what you're looking for. In the post, you're looking for the W result form variable. In that W result form variable, you are going to get the XML, and I have a utility helper method called get values from W result. Excuse me. Go to okay. Where's my utility class? We'll fix that. So here is my get values from W result. I'm just parsing out the XML, so I'm just grabbing some of it and then doing some link to the XML to grab out things like the tenant node, which is in the attributes descendant. There's a name value, and you get the tenant node, and then you can get the user email address if you want. I'm not actually using this, but this is just a sample of how you can get that if you need it. The user display name, etc. So I mentioned there's some other details you can grab. Here's where we're looking at those details. And then we need some other identifiers. So this just maps it through. And if you want, in this process, you can go retrieve an access token, or you can do that at some other stage if you want to. And I put a link in here for an example of how you can get access tokens from the graph. That's sort of out of scope of what we're talking about here, but there's a link in there to go learn on that topic if you're not familiar to it. And then I just put these into my model object. Now I have the data that I need in my handler to put into the database. So I can do this try add tenant, and this writes it into, I don't know why it's giving me grief here, but in my database issuer name registry, which is right here, I have my triad tenant bit where I can add that to the database. Here we go. So I'm putting it into the database through the model and saving the changes. That way I'll know if a user, if the Azure AD admin has authorized for the domain and a user comes and logs into the page, it's going, when they log in, it's going to post back that W result with their tenant ID. If that tenant ID already exists in the database, then I know that that's been authorized. I can let it pass through. If it's not, then they'll have to do a new authorization back. Okay, so just a basic code for adding that into the database. And then I just redirect it to where I want it to go, and I just pass in this parameter for the subscription token over to the default ASPX page. It's actually not, you don't really need to do that. You can just pass it on to the page. So that handles the flow once they've logged in. But to get there, to first log in, if you want them to do it through directly through the app, you're going to need a way to manage that. Let me show you how we do it. You can implement your own mechanism, whatever works for you, but I'll show you how we do it to give you an idea. So if you go to cktrainingplus.com, you'll get our anonymous landing marketing page. And then there's a sign-in link in the upper right-hand corner. If you click on that sign-in link, it will take you to the sign-in page. I have 3 buttons here: sign in, authorize, and cancel. And I try to explain here to the user what they need to do. The problem being that because I don't control the next page, I can't tell them what they need to do in context of where the sign-in boxes are. So I'm trying to tell them in advance, okay? If the user is just doing this individually and it's already been authorized, they can just click sign in, authorize it for themselves, and they're good to go. If this is the first time it's being done by an Azure admin, they could click the authorize button. That will take it to the consent. Now, I have already authorized this app for my domain, so now it's just asking me to log in, and it won't actually do the consent because it already exists. But what you'll see when you do that is you log in and you'll get the consent screen. This posted over, if you look at the URL, which I know is hard to see on your monitors, but if you look on the URL, you'll see what I mentioned to you earlier, the and prompt equal admin consent. This is telling it that I want this to be the admin consent page. If I go back a page and just go sign in, it's a different authorization flow. And you'll see here that it has parameter values, but it does not have the prompt for admin consent. Okay, that's just a direct sign in. That is controlled in the sign in page. If you wish to have your own sign in page, you can have it here. And you can set the authenticate button and send it with its cookies and whatnot for the sign in to authenticate the user. I don't yet have the OAuth 2 authorization flow in this particular sample. But it's well documented as to how you can include that in there if you want to add an additional button for authorize. This one here is assuming it's done through the gallery. Now, once the app has been, once you have all these piece parts together and you've created the database and you have your various objects for parsing things out, you'll need to set up the web config with some additional information. So a connection to your database, obviously. You'll need to set the federation metadata location with his login windows.net. This can point to your tenant ID. That's okay here. But for the other scenarios, you want it to point to the common endpoint. You have a realm and audience URI, your client ID, and hosting tenant ID, etc. And then down here, there's a couple other points that you want to be aware of here. You want to make sure you have the WSFed endpoint set to common WSFed. It doesn't do that by default, so make sure you have it set that way. If you want to require SSL, you can set that there as well. Make sure you plug in your realm, which is your app ID URI. Okay, plug that in there as well. So you've got those pieces in your web config. You're now ready to deploy this in a multi-tenant scenario. So let's talk about the deployment process. All right, we already looked at the configuration screen, so let's talk about deployment. A couple of different ways you can do this. Users can just navigate directly to your application on a public URL. If you have a sign-in mechanism and an authorization mechanism, they can deploy that way. They can also go through the Azure AD Gallery. So if you publish to the portal, if I'm over here in the Azure portal, I can go to Azure AD, and I can go to Enterprise Applications. If I show all my applications, you'll see that somewhere along here are things like there's Training Plus from CK. There's my web application 31 that we just created a minute ago. You can add a new one from here. So do an add, and it'll go to the gallery. All right. You could do all, and then you could do a search, for example. So I can do not sure if this is in here yet. Training. There we go. There's Training Plus. So you can, that would be your app, and then you can, users can add it in through there. Now, when they do that, it's going to be authorized for the domain, but it's not actually going to be applied to any users. They can't see it in the app launcher yet, which is a significant change, as I mentioned earlier, from the classic portal, and something we're working with the Azure AD teams to see if we can either resurrect the old behavior or give us a better mechanism. Because what happens here is, let me just step back in my blades. You will see an application like Training Plus that's been authorized for the domain. Okay, that's great. How do I actually get this to my users? Well, if I go to users and groups, right, I don't have the ability to add my assign this to a group because I'm not using Azure AD Premium. So the provisioning expects that it will go to an Azure AD Premium or an Azure AD Group, which can only be accessed by if you have Azure AD Premium. So that's a bit of a bummer there. Fortunately, there's a way we can work around that. In my Azure AD, I have a group called United States. And I've added everybody into that group. So I've added all my users to this group, United States. Okay. You can create groups in Azure AD without having Azure AD Premium. You just can't do app assignment and other things to them without Premium. So I've created this group called United States and put everyone in it. In my enterprise application, if I go to self-service, I can turn this on, allow users to request access to this application. I could turn it on and I can select a group. When I select that group, if it has everybody in it, which United States does, and I select that particular group, and I save this now, it will automatically provision it to everyone in that group without the need for Azure AD Premium. So it's hidden away in this self-service thing here, so it's not intuitive at all. But you can assign it to everyone in your tenancy the way we used to do in the old portal by using this workaround trick right here. Otherwise, it expects you to do assignment by user and group, and I don't have group here because I don't have Azure AD Premium. You will if you have Azure AD Premium. Okay, so although I think the desired state as it's distributed through Azure AD Premium, it's not required. There's a workaround for that. However, if you are providing this application to customers, you're going to need to tell them that. You need to give them a setup guide or a walkthrough or a quick video or something so they'll know, because otherwise they won't. And they'll be saying, hey, I can't get this to show up for any of my users. It's there, it just doesn't show up in the app launcher. The only person who'll see it in the app launcher is the Azure admin who authorized it in the first place. So if you're having that problem, they can't see it in the app launcher, this is what's going on. Go into the new portal and use that self-service mechanism to work around that. So it's the 2 stages down in the distribution box. Admin authorization, meaning this app can be used in our domain, and the actual assignment to the users, allowing them to see it in their app launcher. Incidentally, by the way, if it's been added to the domain already by the admin and the user navigates to the URL, if they know the URL to go to, once it's been authorized for the domain, it will allow the user to navigate to the app and sign in if you've provided a sign-in mechanism, because it's already authorized for the domain. So all your users can access it at that point. They just have to know the URL to go to so that they can get it. And then it will show up in their app launcher. But doing a user-by-user login basis isn't probably how you want to distribute apps. You primarily want to do that, obviously, through the app launcher. And so you'll need to use that Azure AD Premium group deployment model or the workaround for the deployment model. Okay, so that is the end of our time. Unfortunately, it's also the end of our content. Let me just mention to you briefly, again, if you want to get the code, you can go to github.com/eshups. And it's the SP Azure AD demo REST. Here, if you look in all the repositories Here it is. So that's all the code that I walk through with the SQL script and all of the token settings, tokenized parameters in the web config, and all that stuff. So that's all there for you. And you can pull down that code and work with it. So I'm happy to now answer any questions. Of course, you can offline those questions. Ping me on Twitter or Facebook. If you look, go to my blog at ericschups.com and post a comment on any of the posts. I'll be happy to respond to you there as well. Don't forget, Combined Knowledge brought this webinar to you. You can visit them at combined-knowledge.com. There are upcoming webinars on June 15th, which is a go live with Office 365 adoption with Chris Casangina, and again on the 21st in What's New with Power BI with Ted Pattison. So you can go to combined-knowledge.com to sign up for those and to join those webinars. So thank you all for attending. You should receive a follow-up email with a link to the video of this. So if you'd like to go back and review it, I'll keep it open for just a couple of more minutes in case there are any questions. But thank you all for joining me today on the Combined Knowledge Office 365 webinar series.